Okay, continuing along in Report from Iron Mountain. As you remember, we are in Section 6, Substitutes for the Functions of War, and this is Part 5. The real question here, therefore, does not concern the viability of this war substitute, but the political problems involved in bringing it about. It cannot be established while the war system is still in effect. The reason for this is simple. Excess population is war material. As long as any society must contemplate even a remote possibility of war, it must maintain a maximum supportable population, even when so doing critically aggravates an economic liability. This is paradoxical in view of war's role in reducing excess population, but it is readily understood. War controls the general population level, but the ecological interest of any single society lies in maintaining its hegemony vis-a-vis other societies. The obvious analogy can be seen in any free enterprise economy. Practices damaging to the society as a whole, both competitive and monopolistic, are abetted by the conflicting economic motives of individual capital interests. The obvious precedent can be found in the seemingly irrational political difficulties which have blocked universal adoption of simple birth control methods. Nations desperately in need of increasing unfavorable production-consumption ratios are nevertheless unwilling to gamble their possible military requirements of 20 years hence for this purpose. Unilateral population control, as practiced in ancient Japan and in other isolated societies, is out of the question in today's world. Since the eugenic solution cannot be achieved until the transition to peace system takes place, why not wait? One must qualify the inclination to agree. As we noted earlier, a real possibility of an unprecedented global crisis of insufficiency exists today, which the war system may not be able to forestall. If this should come to pass before an agreed upon transition to peace were completed, the result might be irrevocably disastrous. There is clearly no solution to this dilemma. It is a risk which must be taken. But it tends to support the view that if a decision is made to eliminate the war system, it were better done sooner than later. Cultural and scientific. Strictly speaking, the function of war as a determinant of cultural values and as the prime mover of scientific progress may not be critical in a world without war. Our criterion for the basic non-military functions of war has been: are they necessary to the survival and stability of society? The absolute need for substitute cultural value determinants and for the continued advance of scientific knowledge is not established. We believe it important, however, in behalf of those for whom these functions hold subjective significance, that it be known what they can reasonably expect in culture and science after a transition to peace. So far as the creative arts are concerned, there is no reason to believe they would disappear, but only that they would change in character and relative social importance. The elimination of war would in due course deprive them of their principal conative force. But it would necessarily take some time for the effect of this withdrawal to be felt. During the transition, perhaps for a generation thereafter, themes of socio-moral conflict inspired by the war system would be increasingly transferred to the idiom of purely personal sensibility. At the same time, a new aesthetic would have to develop. Whatever its name, form, or rationale, its function would be to express, in language appropriate to the new period, the once discredited philosophy that art exists for its own sake. This aesthetic would reject unequivocally the classic requirement of paramilitary conflict as the substantive content of great art. The eventual effect of the peace world philosophy of art would be democratizing in the extreme, in the sense that a generally acknowledged subjectivity of artistic standards would equalize their new content-free values. What may be expected to happen is that art would be reassigned the role it once played in a few primitive peace-oriented social systems. This was the function of pure decoration, entertainment, or play, entirely free of the burden of expressing the socio-moral values and conflicts of a war-oriented society. It is interesting that the groundwork for such a value-free aesthetic is already being laid today in growing experimentation in art without content, perhaps in anticipation of a world without conflict. A cult has been developed around a new kind of cultural determinism, which proposes that the technological form of a cultural expression determines its values rather than does its ostensibly meaningful content. Its clear implication is that there is no good or bad art, only that which is appropriate to its technological times and that which is not. Its cultural effect has been to promote circumstantial constructions and unplanned expressions. It denies to art the relevance of sequential logic. Its significance in this context is that it provides a working model of one kind of value-free culture we might reasonably anticipate in a world at peace. So far as science is concerned, it might appear at first glance that a giant space research program, the most promising among the proposed economic surrogates for war, might also serve as the basic stimulator of scientific research. The lack of fundamental organized social conflict inherent in space work, however, would rule it out as an adequate motivational substitute for war when applied to pure science. But it could no doubt sustain the broad range of technological activity that a space budget of military dimensions would require. A similarly scaled social welfare program could provide a comparable impetus to low-key technological advances, especially in medicine, rationalized construction models, educational psychology, etc. The eugenic substitute for the ecological function of war would also require continuing research in certain areas of the life sciences. Apart from these partial substitutes for war, it must be kept in mind that the momentum given to scientific progress by the great wars of the past century, and even more by the anticipation of World War III, is intellectually and materially enormous. It is our finding that if the war system were to end tomorrow, this momentum is so great that the pursuit of scientific knowledge could reasonably be expected to go forward without noticeable diminution for perhaps 2 decades. It would then continue at a progressively decreasing tempo for at least another 2 decades before the bank account of today's unresolved problems would become exhausted. By the standards of the questions we have learned to ask today, there would no longer be anything worth knowing still unknown. We cannot conceive by definition of the scientific questions to ask once those we can now comprehend are answered. This leads unavoidably to another matter: the intrinsic value of the unlimited search for knowledge. We, of course, offer no independent value judgments here, but it is germane to point out that the substantial minority of scientific option feels that search to be circumscribed in any case. This opinion is itself a factor in considering the need for a substitute for the scientific function of war. For the record, we must also note of the precedent that during long periods of human history, often covering thousands of years, in which no intrinsic social value was assigned to scientific progress, stable societies did survive and flourish, although this could not have been possible in the modern industrial world. We cannot be certain it may not again be true in a future world at peace. And this ends section 6, which is substitutes for the function of war, and in the next videos, we will pick up with section 7, summary and conclusions. Hang in there.